Cool. So we are in our sort of loose journey of the through the Torah, and I say very loose because we're not necessarily rooting ourselves in the story, but we are following the parshiot. We are now in the book of Shemot, Sefer Shemot, which means we're really digging into the stories that that bring our people into peoplehood, right? Beyond just a family, but into peoplehood. And so this week, right, the beginning of the Parshat Shemot is really the beginning of this story in which the relationships that had been built between Pharaoh and Joseph start to crumble, and the sort of reversal of the protected status that was the Israelites, or not yet even really Israelites, this family, extended family, shifts, and we're moving to a place where their lives are becoming much more restricted and dangerous. And the section of Talmud we're going to learn is I don't want to say meandery, but it covers a variety of different subjects, because what it does, and we haven't really learned a style like this yet, which is it takes sort of verse by verse in this beginning chapter and gives us interpretations about what's happening. There's some really interesting ones in there and some less interesting ones in there. And I thought we'd sort of see how much of it we can learn this week. Any questions before we start? Cool. All right, let's get into it. Let me share my screen. Can everybody see this okay? Yes, thumbs up. Amazing. Amazing. All right, so nice to be back on my desktop computer so I can actually see everybody's face, and I'm not squished on my laptop. Okay, so we are in Masechet Sota, which we have actually learned quite a bit of over the course of the last year, 6 or 7 months now. I don't specifically look for a particular Masechet, but it's sort of interesting to keep finding ourselves in Sota. We're on 11a. And it begins by sort of talking about the story beginning in Exodus. So just as I was talking about, can I get a volunteer to start us off and read this first paragraph? All right, Bob, go for it. Bill, I'll get you on the next one.
The Gemara proceeds to discuss the sojourn of the Jewish people in Egypt. The verse states, "And there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph." Rav and Shmuel disagree about the interpretation of this verse.
All right, I'm going to pause you there really quick, Bob. Sorry. Okay, so we already know, right? We're going to discuss this verse. And in the Aramaic, it just gives us the verse. Vayakom melech hadash v'gomer. Right? V'gomer is like, and so on, etc. Rav and Shmuel were the Hillel and Shammai of their era. They were always on the opposite side of an argument. They were always disagreeing with each other. So when you see Rav and Shmuel, we already know they're going to sort of diametrically be in opposition to one another. All right, continue, Bob.
One says that this means he was actually a new king, and one says that this means that his decrees were transformed. As if he were a new king.
All right, I'm going to interrupt you again. We already have this interesting thing happening, which is that we don't know whose opinion says what, right? We have here in the Aramaic, chad, which in this case is the word echad, like one in Aramaic, chad emar, and then it says v'chad emar, meaning to say, we have Rav and Shmuel, we know they disagreed, we're not sure which one says which. All right, keep going. So we have the opinions. One says there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph, and the surface reading of the text would say new Pharaoh. The old Pharaoh died, new Pharaoh here, and they disagree about what this means. One says it's an actual new king, and the other one says the decrees were changed, and it was as if he was a new king. All right, keep going.
The one who says that he was actually a new king holds that it is because it is written new. And the one who says his decrees were transformed holds that it is because it is not written. And the previous king of Egypt died, and a new king reigned. This indicates that the same king remained. According to this interpretation, the words "who knew not Joseph" mean that he was like someone who did not know him at all. Although he certainly knew Joseph and his accomplishments, he acted as if he didn't.
Okay, so here we get these two arguments. We have one that says an actual new king came, and one says it's the same guy, but who's acting anew. The argument for a new king is because it says new king, right? It literally uses the word, it says right here, Chadash Mamash, right? A new king, an actual new king, because it says Chadash, new in the verse, right? And there arose a new king, Melech Chadash. The other argument that it was actually the old king, but acting in a new way, is because it didn't tell us that he died and a new king came and reigned, right? Because we would presume that if the Pharaoh died, we would have been told the Pharaoh died. And that leaves us with a problem, which is who knew not know Joseph, right? If you knew, if it was the same guy, he would know Joseph. Why does it say he knew not Joseph? The argument is it was as if he acted as if he did not know Joseph, right? Again, this is, I think, not the shot of the text. We're pulling the threads here a little bit. Yeah, Sheila.
I mean, I just don't even understand that there is such a question. It's very logical that the king died. I mean, after all, the king, we're assuming that the king who Joseph, how long was Joseph the second in command? How long? I mean, it's very possible that the king would not know him anymore, that there was a new king. Now, when it said no, I mean, where it says that they just, disregarded what he had done. And we don't know that it was a revolt against Joseph or a revolt against, why he felt that way. We're making it personal against the Jews, but he could have had some other problems in his land. And did he get rid of all the things like storing up the food for 7 years? There's a time element there that bothers me.
Yeah, so my sense is that the famine has come and gone a long time in the past. This is quite a time later, and we later on will find out that the people have grown. We learned this in the Torah itself, right? That the amount of people has really grown, which means that we're talking with enough time that people have had children and their children have had children, right? Yeah. It is very logical from the surface reading of the text to presume the Pharaoh died and there was a new Pharaoh, right? Like that is how we generally understand this text, and it is pshat. It is what the verse basically says. We have an alternative opinion here, which doesn't work for you, which is why Rav and Shmuel disagree, which says it didn't say he died, and therefore we can't confirm and say he died. Because in other places it says, it doesn't make this argument, but in other places we have kings who died and then became new kings come into their place. And so because it doesn't say that, we can't be certain. Yeah, Karen.
So my assumption was that there was a, not a rebellion, but a takeover. There arose a new king over Egypt, says to me, like a different group is taking over.
Dynasty.
I've never thought of it that way, right? A third option would be that there was a coup. The old Pharaoh was out, the new Pharaoh was in.
Isn't that what all the historical things say?
I don't know. I have to admit I've never thought that before.
Where's David Schifrin? He knows these. No, I mean, I think Karen is right. It's just simply, if it wasn't a direct coup, it was someone who, he forgot that there was a famine once.
I think
it's like Chavero. She didn't read the archives. Nobody read the archives to him, so he didn't know about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about this piece, right, isn't that we think Rav or Shmuel. Well, I'll speak for myself. It's not because I think Rav or Shmuel, whichever one holds by which opinion, is right or wrong, right? Like, I think this is a reminder, right? Because remember, the Gemara is a midrashic, pedagogic, legal, like it's all those things rolled into one, that we want to have a close reading of the text. It doesn't say that the Pharaoh died. And to assume that the Pharaoh died is a jump on our part. Now, I do actually think that that's the most reasonable conclusion, because we're talking generations later. But I do think that we're in that this invites us into thinking in expansive ways, and I think that's to our advantage. All right, let's keep going, because there's a lot of these kinds of things, and there's some in particular I want to jump to. Okay, so it's going to go verse by verse by verse. So the next verse is verse 9. That was verse 8. This is verse 9. Bill, you were next. Are you ready to read?
Yeah, well, I got some. How do I just get this to be full screen? I can't figure that. I got something on the side over here, so it makes it smaller, but I can read it.
Okay, I'm not sure what you're looking at, so I can't help you, but
Okay, I'll just read it. I clicked on something, but I got a panel on the side. Okay, where should I start? The next verse states?
Yep.
The next verse states, and he said to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. It was taught, Pharaoh, initiated the proposal. Therefore, of his people, he was stricken first. He initiated the proposal as it is written. And he said to his people, therefore he was stricken first, as it is written, and the frogs shall come up both upon you and upon your people and upon all its servants.
Okay.
I do have a question. Is
Yeah.
Joseph alive during this time? It says we got a new king. Doesn't say anything about Joseph.
Yeah, my sense, the short reading of the text, right, ignoring this alternative, it was the same Pharaoh, but he didn't know Joseph. My sense was the shot of the text is, right, the surface reading of the text is that time had passed and that there was a new Pharaoh because the old Pharaoh had died, and that, Joseph and that Pharaoh had died. Like time had passed. And as a result, the new Pharaoh, right, as I think Ron said, right, didn't read the archives, doesn't know the history, and therefore doesn't know the things that Joseph had done on behalf of Egypt, such that that the people of Israel, this family, right, had this high status, this protected status, so that when this new Pharaoh is sort of taking a look at his kingdom, he sees this particularly privileged group that has power and resources and great land, right? The land of Goshen was great land, and has grown in number. And as a result, which we're told before this, which scares him. He's afraid. He says, I've got this whole non-Egyptian group in my land, and that scares me for political and safety reasons. Now, whether or not Pharaoh should have thought that is a different question. That, I think, is the logical surface reading of what happens in the story. Whether or not he should have felt that way is a different question. And so my sense is that this is quite a bit later. I don't have it open in front of me, but we could look at the first few verses, between, verses 1 through 7, and I'm sure it says how many years. Anyway, Bob.
Yeah.
Dave, yeah, sorry, Bill, what were you going to say?
Yeah, that still doesn't answer the question. Is Joseph alive?
I don't think Joseph is alive.
Okay.
Joseph died at the end of last week's Parsha, and I think about 200 years went by between the end of last week's Parsha and the beginning of this week's Parsha. Because Joseph died, all the brothers died. There's no reason to think that this is the same Pharaoh, and I think it's a couple hundred years later.
Well, it says it's a different Pharaoh, so we don't have to think it's the same one.
Right. Well, that's what makes the interpretation of Rav or Shmuel here, that it's the same Pharaoh, particularly interesting, I think.
If we translate, as I said before, if we take the word Pharaoh and instead say dynasty,
right, but it doesn't say
this
that.
Pharaoh may have been if it's 200 years later, even 100 years later, I think that this is a different period. I mean, in other words, a pharaoh, really a new pharaoh. They had a lot of foreign people coming in to their land, into
Right.
Egypt to rule.
Right.
And that is,
I don't think that that's what it, I don't think it says dynasty. I think it just
it
says,
doesn't, but I'm just saying, I think
Sure.
that
all right, Bob, David, Karen, is your hand still up? Great. And then we'll unpack the section we just read here. Bob, go for it.
I think that the size of the Jewish community shows the passage of time.
Yeah.
In order them to go from the family of Joseph to being a perceived danger to the Pharaoh shows that there was a significant passage of time. And that's the proof that proves the point that it's a new Pharaoh.
I think that's right. Later on, I think it's on this page that I'm hoping to get to. It offers a number, and the numbers in the hundreds of thousands, which again, numbers in the Talmud and in some numbers in the Talmud and definitely numbers in the Tanakh should be taken with a grain of salt. But certainly for a population to grow in that size, it had to be a significant number of generations later.
Isn't it said that the Hebrew women were extraordinarily fertile in this period and had many multiple births so that the Hebrew community grew so fast?
that's Moses.
Yeah, I off the top of my head, I don't have a sense of that verse, but I have heard such things. David and then Karen.
So this is a very strange idea that it would be the same king for the reasons that have been stated, but I just have to add some things from, if you will, history and archaeology. One is that this fits really well with the pharaoh of Joseph being a Hyksos pharaoh. In other words, an Asiatic invader who becomes pharaoh by adopting the local practices, if you will. And when the new kingdom begins, which really does coincide very nicely with what we seem to know about the timing of the Exodus, the new kingdom is a native kingdom and very strong and very opposed to the Asiatics. So that also fits well with the story. That and the fact that it says somewhere later on, possibly right in this parsha, I'm not sure, I didn't read through it in advance, or I did, but that was a year ago, so I don't remember that well. It says something about how many years we were in Egypt, and clearly that's a lot of years. So not all in slavery, but quite a number of years anyway. So all of that being stated, which seems to be more or less factual, the idea that it could be the same king seems very strange, and one wonders where that's leading. And now I'm going to turn it back over to you to help us get there.
Yeah, I don't actually think it goes anywhere. I think it shows up in another place in the Talmud. So the same paragraph appears in more than one place. I don't take it anywhere here, which I think is that much more fascinating, where we basically have a collection of different midrashim based on the verses, and they don't really go anywhere. And so I think for us, it's really just like, here's kind of a crazy idea that we can hold on to. I don't actually think that it makes more sense, but it's fascinating to entertain, certainly. Karen.
So the two verses preceding this verse are Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. And then, but the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so the land was filled with them. So in order for that whole generation to have died, and for the Israelites to have been prolific and have a lot of children, it's impossible for it to be the same Pharaoh. And I think, didn't God tell, is it Abraham, that we were going to be slaves in Egypt for 400 years?
Yes.
So this is right before we go out. So it's 400 years from when, so it can't be the same Pharaoh. I feel like they're arguing this just to for an intellectual argument, not.
Well, I am not claiming that I think it makes any sense, but you're right. I think this is, I think this disagreement between Rav and Shmuel is an intellectual exercise. Because I think the sheer logic of this would suggest that it can't possibly be the same Pharaoh, which I think that makes it interesting. We then get in the section that Bill read, right, that this Pharaoh, and I think we can just sort of generally agree that this new Pharaoh, the 400 years I don't think has started yet in this, because I think it starts when the slavery begins, which hasn't happened yet in our story, but certainly it's been a significant amount of time for however many people there are. We have this, and he, the Pharaoh, said to Pharaoh's people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. And if you have this group that's all of a sudden everywhere, and all of a sudden in air quotes there, it makes sense that he might feel this way. He's like, oh, we're outnumbered, which of course is sort of ridiculous. It was taught, and you see this reference to Tosefta 4:11. Are people familiar with the concept of the Tosefta? Yes, a little bit. The answer can be no. Yes, a little bit. So I'm just going to add, yes, Karen, to you. I see that. Just to add it in one sentence, there were multiple rabbinic collections happening at the same time in the early period. You have the Mishnah is one. You have various collections of Midrash, and one of those collections is called the Tosefta. And it's basically a less organized, more chaotic version of the Mishnah that has all sorts of stuff that got edited out when we got the Mishnah that got kept in the Tosefta. Like Tosefta comes from the same word, lahosif, to add. I like to think of it, as my teachers taught me, it's like everything that was on the cutting room floor got collected. The Tosefta is one of the sources for Baraitot, right? The teachings from the Tannaitic era that end up in the Gemara are often from the Tosefta. And here in the Talmud, it just says Tana. It was taught, basically we would translate this as it was taught in a Braita. Here we happen to know that it's a specific reference to Tosefta 4:11. The Tosefta of Masechet Sota would be the piece. Pharaoh initiated the proposal. So here we're getting something specific, which is it's not just that this that Pharaoh wanted, it wasn't like Haman who came up with the idea for Achashverosh. Here we're being told Pharaoh is the one who came up with the idea of enslaving them. How do we know this? According to the verse, it says, and he said to his people, Vayomer el imo, to his people. As a result, he owns some of the blame, and therefore, when the plagues come, we find out he was stricken first, and the frog shall come up both upon you and upon your people and upon your servants. Right, the three categories: you, your people, your servants. You comes first, and that's because it was his idea, because he's the one proposing it to his people. That's the argument in this paragraph. Yeah, Sheila.
Well, actually, then we're certainly saying that it sounds like the people are not necessarily with the Pharaoh. If it's the Pharaoh's idea, they're not saying the Pharaoh that the people were unhappy, but the Pharaoh did this, and therefore the Pharaoh did this. It is simply putting the whole thing on the Pharaoh, who is possibly doing this because he's trying to consolidate his hold on the people. And he's afraid that maybe the people may remember Joseph, and they remember, that, hey, he did good for us. That they're not bothering us in Goshen. Let's leave him alone. He's picking on a group of people to try to, why is he doing it? He's afraid of them.
I
Why?
think an important piece is, I think the Gemara is making a nice nuance, which is he started it, but he is not the only one who's responsible, because it takes everybody to follow through on enslaving another people or harming another people, right? Everybody has a responsibility, right? Because if Pharaoh had said, let's enslave these people, and nobody did anything, what would have happened? Nothing. So again, it's not that the people are not without fault. It's that he claims the first fault. Yeah, Sheila and then Ron.
I hate to do this, and I hope it's not going to elicit too much discussion, but you can almost compare it to Trump or whatever is going on now with the MAGA people. They were quiet until Trump got them all revved up. And then, I mean, they always had this opinion. They did not like the rest
So
of the
I'm going to interrupt you because I don't want to really get into politics, but I would say the following, which is that human beings are human beings. And one of the things we learn from the rabbis is how human they are and how human they tell stories. And well, I certainly have my own opinions about our current political climate. I do think that in a society, each and every one of us have a responsibility, and we each have our role to play. And as Superman says, right, truth, justice, and the American way, right? That's I think the things we can strive for: integrity and kindness. And we each have a role in that. That is how I'm going to respond to what you said. Ron.
I'd be shocked if the people didn't have the same opinion, because if you remember what Joseph did to them during the 7 years of famine, he ended up with, or not he, but the Pharaoh ended up with all their wealth. They were all moved away from where they were living. I would think they would have long memories about that. Of course, if the Pharaoh can forget Joseph, maybe the people could forget Joseph also. But
yeah, I mean, humans have fickle memories, right? How much we forget of eras gone long, not that long past, right? There's a famous quote falsely attributed to Mark Twain of "History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes." And I find that to be a really powerful framing. And so here, once again, the land has hit crisis, maybe a crisis of their own making, and people make choices. All right, let's we're going to skip a few pieces because I think there are some more interesting ones and I want to utilize our time well. I'm just going to highlight a few interesting things here because of the grammar in Exodus 10, where it says, "Let us deal wisely with," and it says "lo," to him, an individual, when it should be "lahem," to them, the people. And here we have a conclusion. Why does the Torah say it this way? Should have been in plural. Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says that Pharaoh was saying, "Come, let us deal wisely with regard to an individual, which is the Savior of Israel, which is God." Which then, again, in the interpretation of the rabbis here, makes Pharaoh's choices that much worse, right? It's not just against people, it's against God. And I think there's something fascinating about that. Okay, let's keep going because I don't want to get lost in that. Here, this section says, okay, how might Pharaoh's advisors say, right? We are going to kill the Israelites. How do we do that? And then, of course, the rabbis imagine that the advisors are quoting verses. "We shall judge them with fire because God will come in fire," or "let us judge them in water." And then it says, well, you know, the Holy One, blessed be God, already took a note that God was not going to bring a flood upon the world, right? Because of the story of Noah. And the Pharaoh's advisor said they weren't sure that God would not bring a flood. They were sure that the flood would not go against the whole world, but might come against their land individually, one nation, which I thought was so fascinating. But I don't want to get into it too much.
That's Yom Kippur liturgy. Who by water and who by fire?
Very much playing with that kind of thinking. Absolutely. Here it talks about a different one. It's not a flood, but that they are going to fall into water. All sorts of interesting stuff. But here's the part I wanted to bring us to, which I think is super interesting. The rabbis imagine that Pharaoh is getting counsel from all sorts of people about what Pharaoh should do about this Israelite people. And we have this very interesting, totally anachronistic, strange response, which is Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, Rabbi Simai says, 3 noteworthy people were consulted by Pharaoh in that council where Pharaoh questioned what should be done with the Jewish people. They were Bil'am, Job, and Yitro. Now, I think this makes very little sense in the literal sense, in the sense that Bil'am comes much later in the story, when he's already, when Bil'am, people have already left. And certainly Bilam could have been alive, unclear. Job and Yitro is Moses's father-in-law, so that's interesting. And I'm not really sure what to do with Job, truth be told, but we have this interesting story. And so I want to challenge us not to ask the question of why, like, is this possible? Because the answer is maybe, but probably not. But ask why the rabbis want this to be true. Like, why are they telling us this story? Can I get a volunteer to read the explanation of these three characters? Somebody want to read? Yeah, Sheila, you're right. You were third. Go for it.
Rabbi Chia bar Abba teaches what occurred to each of them. Balaam, who advised Pharaoh to kill all sons born to the Jewish people, was punished by being killed in the war with Midian. Job, who was silent and neither advised nor protested, was punished by suffering, as detailed in the eponymous book in the Bible. Yitro, who ran away as a sign of protest, I assume what he means is he left and followed Moses somewhere, merited that some of his children's children sat in the Sanhedrin in the chamber of hewn stone, as it is stated, and the family of scribes who dwelt at Yabez, Tirathites, Shemithites, and Sukathites, these were the Canaanites who descended from Hamath, the father of the house of Rechav. As is written, the children of the Canaanite, Moses' father-in-law. Okay, this teaches that the Canaanites, descendants of Yitro, the father-in-law of Moses, dwelt at Yabez, referring to the place where the Jewish people go for advice. That is the chamber of hewn stone.
Okay, there's a lot happening there. Let's unpack them. Let's start with the last one first. So we have Yitro, who is the father-in-law of Moses, and we have this sort of phrasing, right? That that sort of like, you have a map. It's like in those detective shows where they got the map and they got the string linking to all the locations. It's kind of like that. We've got the children of Canaanite, who is the Moses' father-in-law, which is in the book of Judges, who are connected or are referenced in this verse from Chronicles, and they're sort of like we're sort of listing them. The fascinating thing, right, is that Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Simai imagines that Pharaoh comes to Yitro, right, who is not an Israelite, and Yitro basically escapes. He runs away as a sign of protest. Now, whether or not running away is truly a sign of protest is an interesting question. But effectively, we want to see Yitro as a good guy. And because he was protesting, according to this, he has some sort of reward, which is that his descendants are seated in this place of power. Now, Yitro is approached by Moses in Parshat Yitro for advice. And so we already see Yitro in the rabbinic mind as a good guy, right? Who gives good advice. And since he gives good advice, his descendants are also going to be in a place of advice giving. But either way, we have Yitro who protests and is rewarded. Let's go back. We're going to start at the beginning again. We have Bil'am, who we know that Pharaoh ultimately says we're going to kill all the new son, baby boys, right? And that gets blamed here on Bil'am. And the connection being made is that since he was going to kill the sons, he himself was punished by being killed in the war with Midian. And then here's the one I find most interesting, which was Job, who was silent, therefore not saying, yes, you should do this, or no, you should not, was punished by suffering. What's fascinating about this is that in the book of Job itself, Job is not given a real reason as to why he's suffering. Here, which of course is uncomfortable, here Rabbi Chia bar Abba explains why. Job did not say or do anything when the people were about to be harmed. This is a fascinating explanation for his suffering. Something that does not exist in the book itself. What do people, I know this one's sort of wonky. What do people think about this? Yeah, Karen.
So I think the rabbis are very uncomfortable with Job being punished for having done nothing. And so they're going to, what I see is they're going to backstory it and say, okay, he was silent in his own suffering, but he was also silent when he should have stood up for the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And so don't be silent, I guess.
Right. Don't be a bystander.
Yeah.
Right. Is often language that we use. Ron, I saw David, your hand up as well, and then Sheila.
No, I'm
No,
saying what
not you.
Karen did.
Okay, great.
I would, for leaving aside the fact that there's no way that Job was alive at this time, I can't. Job was an Israelite. There's no way he was advising Pharaoh, or would have even been asked.
I'm not sure that Job was an Israelite.
I've always thought he was.
I'm not sure. I'm not saying he isn't. I'm just saying I'm not sure. That's something I would want to check on. But let's assume for the time being that he was, all the more so, right? He doesn't, if he is, we might, if we play rabbis here for a moment, right? Talmudic thinking, if he was an Israelite, we might say he was silent against potential harm to his own people, right? Like what greater sin could that be? And if he wasn't an Israelite, we could make a similar argument. What, you're not going to save somebody, protect a people who's clearly not deserving of harm when they're going to be harmed? Either way, Job doesn't turn out doesn't end up as a winner in that story. Certainly in this vein. But it's an interesting thing. If he is an Israelite, the fact that he would be consulted at all, sort of puts him in this sort of Esther, hidden Jew sort of category. David.
So a couple of things. One is, bless you. One is, this is a kind of an interesting form of literature at all. I mean, other than in fantasy literature in modern times, if you will, we wouldn't have this kind of anachronism and just have it accepted. So I guess I have in my head two possible alternatives. One is it wasn't meant to be accepted. It's just here for a kind of a lesson. And maybe one of the lessons is don't be silent. But then the other alternative is that they're perfectly comfortable with an anachronistic reading. And that raises some interesting thoughts and ideas about the mindset of the rabbis. And then the last thing I'll say is when I've studied the book of Job, which is not too often, but a couple of times, the suggestion I've at least learned up till now, and I'm not sure whether it's based on something stronger than maybe just the opening chapters, I don't know, but is that Job is someone in hoary history, maybe in Mesopotamia or somewhere like that, who is there to tell us that God always was, and that whatever God did or didn't do to Job, or for whatever reason he did or didn't do it involving either Satan or whatever, is for a different reason than these rabbis are using Job. So I mean, I guess we've had other examples, and I've had this in other exposures to Talmud, of rabbis taking things out of context for their own purpose. And maybe this is just another one of those. So that I don't know. That's just some thoughts.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is my sense is, again, it's been a while since I've really studied Job as well, is that in the book itself, when Job asks, why did I experience this? God basically says, shut up, and not really give much of a reason. And so this actually is pretty outrageous in the sense that they're adding information to the story. They're saying Job was punished for a reason. And it wasn't just because the Satan and God were having a wager. So this adds a really tremendous shift in our understanding of that story. So that's the first thing. If we accept it, that goes to the second piece, which is, the question is, are the rabbis comfortable with this anachronism, or are they just playing games? Do they accept this as possible or not? And so I think the answer is yes and no, the most rabbinic answer to this type of rabbinic question, which is to say, I think it's dependent on the rabbi, right? Like the Talmud isn't one opinion. And so like Rabbi Chia bar Abba, we don't know, right? We don't know from this moment if Rabbi Chia bar Abba, quoting Rabbi Simai, if Rabbi Simai was just like, yeah, they all lived at the same time and I can prove it and here's the thing and whatever. Or if Rabbi Simai was saying, here's the lesson you need to learn. Here are the three categories of people represented by Bilam, Job, and Yitro. We don't know. We don't know what his intent was. All we have is the text here. And I'm a firm believer that I was talking about this earlier today and over the course of the week in totally unrelated context to this class, that meaning is made. It's not inherent. So we're imbuing this story with meaning. I think, as an individual, I'm not saying you have to agree with me, I don't think the argument is a literal one. I don't think Rabbi Chia bar Abba is suggesting that all these people were actually consulted by Pharaoh. There's no way. I don't think it means that. I think it means that Bilam, Job, and Yitro were types of people who acquiesced to violence, people who were silent in front of it, and those who protested in some way. Not just violence, but violence against the innocent, right? Now, of course, in our telling of this story, this is our ancestors, so of course we're going to be defensive of them. But the fact that Bilam, Job, and Yitro ostensibly are not part of the Israelite people is part of the lesson here. And so I would argue that this is being taken as a framework more than it is a literal. That being said, now I'm going to disagree with myself. We have all sorts of things where the rabbis will be willing to bend time and space to make things true. If you remember when we were studying the stuff on Jacob's ladder, right? There was a whole thing that the rabbis were saying that the land condensed itself, right? So that Jacob could make it to the place at the particular time, right? And that the day was long for him or something like that, right? So the rabbis were comfortable with some sort of reality bending thing. So whether or not these people were consulted because they all lived at the same time or because, it is, because God made it so, it's tough for us to say. And so I think the rabbis are not of one mind on this. I think we have different people with different opinions, different ways of understanding the world, all existing at the same time. I think I'll say one last thing, and then Sheila, I see your hand up, which is we live in an era obsessed with objectivity. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but we're obsessed with it on some level. This is true, this is not true. This is information, this is misinformation. And again, for really good reason, right? And that's not true in every era. And certainly in this rabbinic era, a sense of objectivity is more is fuzzier. It's objective is more flexible. And I'll add one last piece that I think I've been reading. I love stuff around quantum theory, and I was reading an article about it over the course of the last week. And the whole thing with quantum theory, there's lots of things, and I'm not going to explain it well, and you'll forgive me. The whole point of the quantum theory is that it speaks to the universe on the atomic level, right? Not our macro giant universe, but these tiny little things that interact with each other. And what we learn in the quantum realm is that our interaction with it changes its reality. Meaning to say, there isn't really an objective reality. There's really only a subjective one. And so again, the question of whether or not this is real or not real, or happening or not happening, or at the same time or not, like these can be the Schrodinger's cat. It's as real as we allow it to be, if you will. All right, sorry, there was a lot of ideas all rolled in there, but Sheila, go for it.
Quick question, when they say Rechav, do they mean Rachav? That's from the story of Jericho?
I believe so.
Because the Hebrew says Rechav and does not say Rachav, but that doesn't mean anything.
It could be that it was at the end of the verse and therefore the vowels got shortened. I'd have to double check, but that's my understanding, is that we're
Okay.
talking about the same person. Yeah, Ron.
This is probably off the wall. The rabbis nitpick about the halacha in the Mishnah, and then they turn around and in the Gemara, they go so far off the reservation, making stuff up. I just can't believe it's the same rabbis.
Yeah. I mean, so it's really interesting you say that. Right. So the anything we see sort of in the halachic realm today finds its source in the Talmud. So we definitely have these threads of halacha and agadah interweaving with each other, and those traditions over time have gotten much harder on their boundaries, right? Much more rigid. Right, so we have the halachic, evolution where you have, the Talmud, and you have the Rif at the end of traditional sections of Talmud, excising all of the Aggadic stories and only keeping in the law because he was a judge. And then you have Rambam, who rewrites it into the Mishnah Torah, and you have the Tur do the same thing again a few hundred years later. And you have the Shulchan Aruch take the Tur and make his own Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, until the world we have today, where the halakha is it's not rigid, but it's bounded. It doesn't have a lot of story interwoven. And you have sort of on the other side, right, you have the Talmud and Midrash, which leads us to, Kabbalah and mysticism and Hasidic stories, right, that these threads do exist, but they have diverged in really interesting ways. And there's probably a lesson, right? It's sort of wild to imagine these being the same people in the same room, but perhaps there's a lesson in that also, which is that the Talmud is here to remind us that these things should not be separated so much, that these things do need to live in relationship to one another. Again, we're sort of off the narrowness of our subject, which is totally fine. But I do think this page in particular challenges us, I think, in a lot of really interesting ways. Okay, we've got about 7 minutes left in our time. I'm going to highlight a few other things I think were interesting in this, and then we'll call it a day. So the next verse, right, in verse 10, we're like working our way through, right? We started with verse 8, and then it was verse 9, and then it was verse 10, and now that's where we are, right? So the verse states, and we're only quoting the end, "Come, let us deal wisely with him," right? We talked about that before, where maybe that refers to God, "lest he," probably the people, "multiply and come to pass where there befalls us any war. Israel will also join our enemies and fight against us. Get Israel up out of the land." So the Gemara says, he should have said, "Get us up," as Pharaoh's fear was that the Jewish people would join the enemies of Egypt and drive Pharaoh and the Egyptians out of Egypt. Right, so he said, "Fight against us and get us out of the land," right? So there's a weird framing here, weird language. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says, by stating it this way, Pharaoh is like a person who curses himself, but applies his curse to another, right? Meaning to say, he could have said it a different way, but because of the way he framed it, he made it happen to himself. It's sort of that language, right, of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If I tell myself I'm going to be late, 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 and then I'm late, right? I think that's sort of what's happening here. Okay. I want to see if I want to make sure that this is the part I want to say.
It sounds
Yes.
actually he doesn't want to blame the Egyptian people, but he's blaming instead the Pharaoh. People are just swept along with the
Yeah,
Pharaoh.
we're sort of before the actual thing has happened, right? This is all in the ideation stage. This is all in the ideas part. So I don't think that we haven't blamed the people because the people haven't done anything yet in this part of the story. This section here talks about when they brought a brick mold and they showed that Pharaoh, they hung the mold over Pharaoh's neck so that he would look like he's participating. And so therefore, when the Jews would say, I'm an Eastonis, I'm a delicate person, they would say, what, you got Pharaoh over here who's helping. Why should you complain? This is, again, there's all sorts of really fascinating stuff. What I'm going to do is, because I think this is, so I'm going to just really fast. I know my screen sharing is past. I'm going to pull up this page in the Talmud, and I'm going to put it in the chat because I think it's so interesting, and we're really just barely covering it. That if you wanted to look at it more, you can. So give me 1 second here, and I'm going to share my my screen. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff on this page that we didn't even get to because there's just too much interesting stuff. So here, okay, now we're back. I'm going to drop it in the chat. And if you want to look at it, I would strongly encourage you to do that because there's so much cool stuff. Okay, the last thing I wanted to point out, which were, again, there was more here than I actually thought we would cover, is this last part here. Is this part here. So it says in Exodus 1:11, right? So we're going verse by verse by verse, that it was known Pitom and Ramses, which we now know are the names of pharaohs, right? And again, the history being sort of the retelling of the story, that this stuff doesn't always get, the Torah doesn't necessarily know this, and the rabbis don't necessarily know this, that we now know as a result of archaeology. So then it says this. The verse states that the names of the cities they built were Pitom and Ramses. Rav and Shmuel, here we again, the same disagreement, we don't know which one is which, disagree as to the precise interpretation of this verse, both assuming that only one city was built, which had primary and secondary names, which is not an assumption we would necessarily make. It's not one I've made. I assume they just made 2 cities. Here, they make a different assumption. They say, one says that Pitom was its real name, and why was it, and therefore why was it called Ramses, and then vice versa. Is an appellation indicating that the buildings were constructed, that as the buildings were constructed, they collapsed, mitroses, one by one, and needed to be rebuilt. Meaning to say, Pitom was the name of the city, and it was called Ramses because mitroses, it was constantly falling apart. And one says that Ramses was its real name, Ramses, and why was it called Pitom? Because the opening of the abyss, Pi Tahom, the mouth of the depths, swallowed each building as they constructed one by one, and it sunk into the ground. Meaning to say, these things didn't last. They were constantly falling apart. And Rav and Shmuel, I'm so fascinated to find out where this tradition comes from. Where are they getting this from? But they're doing this wordplay to show that these towns, these cities, we're not staying together, and that the names invite us into that understanding. And David, I'm sure you're about to add something much more accurate here about archaeology. But I think it's so it's so fascinating that this is on here. All right, David, please.
Well, I first thing is, and I don't have the full text in front of me, so I'm making this assumption from the translation we always read, but it says store cities, not store city. If it said store city, that would make this a problem, a grammatical problem that you could solve this way. So maybe they're going somewhere else, maybe they're not. Again, I don't know whether they're going anywhere with this really, but
it says are miskenot, cities.
Yeah, are, so cities. So they're creating a problem apparently where there isn't one grammatically. That's curious in and of itself.
Yes.
And and then the other interesting thing about it is the idea that Pitom comes from P to home, as if the Egyptians were speaking some kind of Hebrew as opposed to Egyptian, is also really fascinating. I mean, why go there? I mean, that's just an interesting, I don't know whether that's a kind of a, so to speak, I'm losing the right word. I don't want mean to say self-aggrandizement, but the idea that your own culture overwhelms your ability to study anybody else's, for which there's a good word, and I can't think of it at the moment. And if Nelson were here, I'm sure he'd supply it. I mean, you know, obviously one reads this from one's modern perspective, and to a great degree one can't help it, but those are the things that strike me about this paragraph. And then it just leads me to the final question of where are they really going with this at all? Because it's just a very curious story from all those different ways, and maybe you can come up with some more curiosities. If they're not going somewhere with it, then what was the point to begin with?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, but I'm going to give Sheila. I know that you.
No, that's why my question is, you know, why are we bothering? Does it make much of a difference, except for one thing? Unless they're trying to show that the Jews were overworked, the Hebrews were overworked, and therefore the work that they did was no longer good, and it was all collapsing about them, and therefore that would anger, say, the Pharaoh.
Yeah, I mean, not this paragraph specifically, but I think all the texts that we learned today, and again, so much more here that sort of plays on these themes and this sort of approach. And again, I would encourage you to click the link and in the chat and really get into it. So I want to ask, I think I want to challenge us to think that this section reminds us that Talmud is not just about answers, right? That it's about all the different ways that we interact with our texts. We interact with them in historical ways, in archaeological ways. We certainly as moderns, we ask it questions, challenging questions, right? Is this a king? Is this a new king? The same king? Is it possible for the laws of reality to be broken, right? Are there ways that we can tell new stories, right? Combined stories like Job and this story. This one here about, like, you know, are there layers to the names, the telling? Like, it's so clear that these, certainly Ramses does not sound like a Hebrew word, right? Even though it's written here in Hebrew letters. I think it invites us to think really, it invites us to think in interesting ways about assumptions that we make about text and about the rabbis and about how we might look at text. You know, we certainly as modern students, we want the text to mean something specific. They don't always mean something specific. I'm reading this book right now about, it's called 25 Great Sentences. And it's just about like really well-written sentences. It is fascinating. I just started it. But the reason why I mentioned this was, oh, totally, it's gone. I had a reason I was mentioning it, but now I can't remember. I think the point that I'm trying to get to is that, oh, I remember. In the book was a story about interpretation. I think it was in this book. It could have been in something else. About the sort of our desire to interpret deeply, and that there was a story about a poem, and the poem had a word in it, and they spent a whole class studying this word and what it meant for the whole poem. And they asked the poet, and the poet said, "Oh, it was a typo," right? That doesn't make those things wrong. That typo is a part of the story. And for us to then say, what are the layers under here? What are the things that we can derive from it, even if it doesn't say that? That's part of what the rabbis are doing. They're willing to bend their own rules a little bit to find something new. And I think there's something to that. There's something inviting about that kind of approach. It's hard as moderns. We want it to mean a thing. We want it to say the thing we want it to say, but I actually don't think the rabbis care about that, or at least the rabbis of the Talmud. I'm going to add one more media reference, and then we'll call it a day because we're quite a bit over today. The other night I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once, and I'm not going to talk about it, although I would strongly encourage you to see it because I thought it was brilliant. But because part of that movie invites us to ask, to let ourselves be silly. It's like Douglas Adams and The Hitchhiker's Guide, right? It's really silly. And I think the rabbis are entitled to be a little silly, and we can be silly with them. And it's okay for not everything to be serious, even in the Talmud, when we want it to be, right? The interpretations that the book of Esther is parody or what's it called?
Satire.
Satire, thank you. Right? Like that's okay. Like that it doesn't just have to be, here are the rules, here's objective truth, here's how you should understand it, here's how you, like, not everything has to be that. And we want it to be as modern so badly. But it's okay for the rabbis to put on a red nose and tell some jokes. Like, again, we're not really all the way there. We're somewhere in the middle. And so I think there's a lot here, and there's a lot of meaning to be made, right? Particularly like Bilam, Job, and Yitro. Like you can make meaning from that, but it also can be a little silly. And I think that that's okay too. All right, this is quite a wild west of a class. Hope it was interesting, certainly. And we'll see you next week. Have a wonderful Shabbos and stay safe.
Too.